Hi friends, I'm Jeffy G. I was thinking I'm overdue for an update on iOS music production. So I started thinking, if I was to start all over again with iOS music production, how would I tackle that differently now than I did 2 years ago when I started? Let me explain. I bought a new iPad in July 2020, and I bought the iPad Pro 12.9 inch. Really happy with that device. And that started me into iOS music production. Like a lot of people, the first couple of apps I used happened to be Launchpad from Ampify and Block Waves, which is really quite good. Those are both sampling programs. They're not really full music production or creating sounds with synths and drums. Over the last 2 years, I've tried dozens and dozens of apps, and I've spent more time actually learning apps than I have in writing songs and creating music, and I don't think that's too unusual. A lot of people that get into iOS music production aren't exactly sure how they're going to use it, so it's kind of a learning experience. The other thing about iOS music is that rather than just pick a DAW and get started, it's a modular approach. You'll need to download individual virtual instruments, drum machines, sequencers, routing software, all kinds of bits and pieces that you'll assemble together in your own way. That's both part of the fun of iOS music production, but it's also a distraction from working on the music itself. Even the very notion of using a DAW is maybe a little bit outdated. Certainly, if you're using a Mac or Windows, you probably have some experience with one of the major DAWs like Ableton or Logic, Reason, Studio One, something like that. But once you get into iOS music production, it becomes more a question of how are you going to use these tools to create the music that you want. In my case, I tend to use my iPad as an ideas machine. I might work on a beat, I might work on a melody or parts of a song. I might even start with samples and a particular instrument, but then when I want to arrange and orchestrate those ideas into a full song, I tend to export everything from my iPad, take it over to my MacBook, and use Logic. That's just my workflow. That isn't to say that you can't do everything on your iPad. You can. And a lot of people are making great music entirely on their iPads. If I was starting it all over again today, fresh, and I just got an iPad, I'd be asking somebody, what's the best apps to use? What's the best DAW? What's the best drum machine? What are the best synths? What are the best effects? And what's the best sequencer for me to create the music that I want? Rather than go through all the process of trial and error, I want someone to point out these are the best tools. And that's what I'm going to do in this video. Get right to the point and tell you what's been most useful for me.
I've divided my recommendations into 3 groups, and you'll see why. The first one is really using your iPad as a studio replacement. And if that's the direction you're going to want a full digital audio workstation with a tracks orientation and mixer and instruments and all of that. I recommend Cubasis 3. If you're looking for something that's cheaper because you're just getting started, use GarageBand. It came with your iPad. It's more powerful than you think, but it does have some limitations like 32 tracks. It doesn't really have a mixer and no master. If you're into more EDM and beat making, you might want to consider Beatmaker 3. Cubasis 3 can do everything that Beatmaker 3 can do, but Beatmaker 3 has this sampler type orientation. If you're coming from an MPC device or a machine from Native Instruments, this interface is going to be maybe more productive for you. I generally recommend Cubasis 3 because there are people coming from Ableton or Logic or Reason, Cubase, some other DAW, and this is the easiest transition, the shortest learning curve. The iOS music production environment is really a modular one, so it lends itself to this do-it-yourself approach. So for producers and musicians that want to create something unique and they're more on the creative side, I would recommend AUM. You may not need a full DAW. AUM may give you everything you want to get your ideas put together and organized. The first thing I noticed with AUM is that I needed a sequencer, so I added Helium from 4 Pockets. It works great and it's reasonably priced. The third category is slightly different. I call it the all-in-one approach. And there are two vendors, probably more, but these are two of the more popular ones. The most popular being the Korg Gadget, and the second being Roland's Zenbeats 3, which just came out with a new user interface. The thing about these all-in-ones is that they give you a DAW, they give you instruments, plugins, everything you need for music creation, but it's all from that one vendor. So you're going to be buying more instruments and effects just from Korg, rather than going out to the internet and downloading plugins that are free. In fact, the Korg device does not support the AU version 3 extension for integrating third-party apps. Roland Zenbeats does, but you have to pay $9.99, I think, to free up the third-party connectivity capabilities, or you can have a Roland Cloud account. But the notion behind these devices is just buy one product, it does everything that you need, and everything's included. When it comes to virtual instruments and plugins, I say it's a non-factor. It all depends on your specific taste, the genre of music you're going to create, and how much of a budget you have. I've downloaded dozens of synths and effects and tried them out, and I keep coming back to the most useful ones for me, but that really depends on my taste and the type of music that I'm creating. Once into the production environment for iOS, there are some other things that you might want. A lot of people are looking for a tool to create chord progressions or bass lines or melody parts, and for that I recommend Scalar 2. There are other products out there that do the same thing, but I think Scalar 2 is best. I tried MIDI packs. It was okay, but not great. Now, for samplers, every DAW that you buy will probably have some sampler built into it, and I recommend trying it and using it. It suits the style of the digital audio workstation. But if you're looking for a third-party solution for sampling, take a look at Koala. It's very low cost. It's very popular. It is more powerful than you think, but it's easy to get started with. When it comes to drums, some of the market leaders for Windows and Mac OS are not in the game for iOS, or at least not yet. So within the realm of low-cost drum machines for iOS, I like Hammerhead Rhythm Station. It's a sample player, comes with a lot of presets, and you can load your own samples into it. The only thing I don't like is that it only has 8 lanes and 16 steps. So it's a simple way to get going with drums. If you're looking for something more complex that has more steps and more lanes, consider Digistix 2. It's highly capable, but it takes a little bit more to learn, and you have to know a lot more about MIDI and what you're doing. And the third thing I'd consider looking at, Drum Computer from Sugarbeats. It is a drum synth, not a sample player. And it's a very powerful synth engine, and the sequencer is really top-notch. But again, it has a learning curve and a price attached to it. I started this journey with some apps by Ampify, which is owned by Novation, partly because they came free with a Launchpad that I bought, and I was trying out the Launchpad. So if you haven't seen Launchpad before, it is free. It's whether you have access to the entire library that matters. So you can, pick different sounds. I really just use this as a way of browsing samples. If I go into the library there, I did subscribe to Amplify Sounds because with my Novation Launchpad, it came with a 1-year free subscription, which is normally around $10 a month. Quite a library, I would say, of sample packs from Amplify that I've had a good time with. So if you open up a sample pack, you can just preview things like some drums. It has some features, but they're all performance related. You can control the volume and you can add effects, and there's even some filter capabilities. But essentially, I don't really build songs in this tool. I sometimes just play around with ideas, and then I create recordings, which you can see quite a list of recordings here. And some of them you've probably heard in my other videos. I often use them as background music. And you can export or share those. All of that work is really playing with samples, and you can import samples from another source, which I do often, but I wouldn't call it traditional music production. It's really just organizing and previewing samples. What I found was there was nowhere to go from Launchpad. It's a good performance tool, but write a song, and how do you play with that song or fully orchestrate that song? And that's where really Block's Wave comes into play. So one of the features of Block's Wave, it has this discovery environment, and I have other videos on this, so I'm not going to go through it. And there is a browser where you can create projects. But what has been most useful for me, and you can see you can organize your samples into different groups. And then so what's happening is I'm using Block's Wave as a tool to organize the samples that I want to make into a song. And I'm controlling things like the key and the tempo for those samples. And then I'm exporting those as a project file. And when you export them, it's going to create a separate file for each sample, and you can import those into a DAW. If you were then to go look at those files, we'll do that with the Files app, iOS projects. And if you were to look in one of these, I'll just pull up this one, silly name walk. See, it has each one of the samples carefully labeled with the song name, the channel, and the key and the beats per minute. And then you can drag those samples into another product. Well, I have my apps organized this way. I have this music production group, and it kind of reflects the journey I've been on. I started with things like Launchpad and Block's Wave, and I quickly moved into GarageBand and realized I needed something a bit better, which resulted in Beatmaker 3 and Cubasis 3. Some of these other things are utilities that I've used along the way. There was a good deal on Mixbox, which is a rack-based effects unit. The Amp 1 I hardly ever use. I just wanted to see if I could plug a guitar into my iPad and play it, and I needed some amp modeling. It was free. It works fine. AudioBus 3 and Share integration between the different apps and Audio Share seem to be the popular utility for storing both samples and music files that I would use in different apps. I have Riffler on there, AUM. Helium is a sequencer I'm using with AUM. You can see I have Scalar 2 and Koala. So I spent a lot of time with these particular apps, and then I have quite a variety of virtual instruments that I've used. Some of them are free. Some of them were inexpensive, like $10. And this just gives you kind of a overview of what some of those virtual instruments are and what I've been typically using. I guess the standout item there is a decent sampler. It was kind of a divergent approach to see whether all of the samples that are available on Piano Book are also available for iOS using Decent Sampler. Yeah, Sample Tank's on there too. That's just a demo version though. It doesn't have full access to the entire library. And then the last group I have is drum machines. I've really been just focused on a couple. I've been using Koala like a drum machine, but I have Rock Drum Machine, Drum Computer, and Hammerhead. Those have been the three that I've focused my attention on. I'm not going to go through all the virtual instruments, but I will tell you that Digitalism and the Bliss Monolith app are two of the synths that I tend to use the most. This one, of course, there's lots of tutorials on this. The presets that are in there are pretty good. I'm pretty happy. Not just with it has a lot of great sounds. See, some famous YouTubers have contributed a fair bit, which make it extremely useful. So it's good. I like Digitalism from AudioKit. AudioKit has a whole line of synth instruments, but I've been particularly happy with. It's good. It's simple, but it gets the job done. There's a random feature in there. It's kind of cool. I find it's got all of the capabilities that I'm looking for. And I'm pretty cheap, so I tend to look for inexpensive synths and virtual instruments that I can use in my iOS music production. On the drums front, I like a couple of different things. I would say Drum Computer is the most comprehensive, but Rock Drum Machine is Drum Computer is actually a drum synth, and you can watch one of my other videos, which is linked above and below. And Drum Computer definitely ranks up there quite highly, but it comes with a lot of examples. And I find the sequencer is really good in Drum Computer, maybe the best. In fact, I was even considering using the sequencer in Drum Computer, but then using Koala or a sample player for the actual sounds from my sample library. But it does have an extensive list of patterns that you can create ahead of time. Even though there's only 8 lanes initially, you can really vary the drum beat with different patterns and string together those patterns in a song. I'm also pretty excited about Hammerhead Rhythm Station. I've been using that a lot lately. It's simple. It has an interesting view on sequencing, and again, it only has 8 lanes and 16 steps, but it's pretty good. I'm getting into it, and it does have the ability to load my own samples. You see up above here, you've only got 8 patterns, whereas Drum Computer has, I think, 16. But I like the way it works. Its simplicity means that you can be productive. So where I am today is I generally am using AUM. And I was on the fence about whether I needed AUM or I could just do everything in Cubasis. And I think it depends on what your ultimate goal is. The nice thing about AUM is it's fun to experiment and mix and create different instruments. So I could, just to give you an idea. A turning point for me with AUM was getting Helium. Helium is a multi-purpose sequencer. It's quite incredible in terms of its power and capability. So you can see here in this example on track 1, I've got just a drum pattern that I've mixed in. But the neat thing about Helium is that you can have, 16 tracks of sequencing. So, there's track 3, there's track 2, back to track 1. And each one of those tracks can be routed to a different instrument in AUM, or the same instrument. And there's just a ton of flexibility there. One of the things I didn't realize at first with Helium is that it has a full clip library that's pretty good. I mean, it's like having a MIDI pack at your disposal. So if you want to import a progression, you can just choose a progression and you can just drag that in, which is pretty cool. Sometimes that can be a faster way of getting an idea put together. It does have a mixer, which is kind of cool. There's a whole controller section that would take quite a while to explain, but it's extremely flexible. So for me, switching from just using AUM as a mixer and router to using it with Helium as a sequencer was really a turning point for me. If you don't know AUM, you should definitely look at some of the tutorials that are online, but it's extremely flexible in its routing capabilities, and that's what I was really after.
There are experts out there that really know iOS music production far better than I do. But hopefully the experience I've had over the last 2 years is valuable to you, and you can take advantage of it. If this is the kind of information that's going to help you, click on the like button, subscribe to my channel, and you'll be notified when there's new videos on iOS music production that can help you in your quest.